Fun fact, most people's first word of the year is happy, but since the UFC parted ways with USADA on the 31st of December, you can be sure many a fighter's first words of 2024 were inject me. As us normies were tessellating with strangers in sweaty venues, the supple end of a fat needle celebrates the exit of USADA by plunging into TJ Dillashaw's rump. Thus 2024 begins, the year of the silent steroid epidemic, and there's a conspiracy afoot.
So it begins.
1st of January 2024, a few hours after the exit of USADA, TJ Dillashaw posts a picture of himself looking thicker than cold gravy. What can you notice here that is a sign of steroid use, fellas? I'll give you a hint. A line of rabbits running away. Receding hairline. And of course he's no stranger to the needle, popping for EPO back in 2019 and getting a 2-year suspension. But can you believe this man made flyweight out there looking like the machinist? In this picture he literally looks like he's just had Manel Cap for breakfast. Patience pays off, he says. The bollocks of this man. And listen, TJ isn't the only one. Name on Frere. 1st of January, a couple of hours after the exit of USADA, we have Conor McGregor swilling some house wine while he announces his fight with Chandler at middleweight in June, which of course we have to take with a pinch of cocaine. This is the same man that reposts memes made to roast him as if he's proud of it. I don't know if that was some sort of strange gloat like John Jones bragging about how he still beat DC despite being a raging coke addict, but alas, his head is cooked. The fact he posts this when it was safe from USADA is quite funny, compounded by the thought of two manlets fighting at middleweight, brothers be out there looking like rugby era Volkanovski throwing 1 mile per hour jabs.
Just a second.
In addition, Jorge Masvidal unretires, also on January 1st. They're not too savvy when it comes to discretion, are they? Jesus Christ. Rumours are that he's coming back to fight Nate Diaz at UFC 300, as much as I doubt that. So within 24 hours of each other on New Year's Day after USADA have just bogged off, TJ Dillashaw announces his comeback, Jorge Masvidal unretires, and we have roided up McGregor announcing a fight with Chandler 3 weight classes above his original.
Coincidence? I think not!
No doubt Paulo Costa is necking the secret juice as we speak, mate.
This
And listen,
secret
this might be
juice.
tinfoil hat territory, but Dana White saying Islam Makhachev isn't fighting until June because he is injured, then this footage being released, he clearly isn't injured, bruv. And since half of these Dagestanis have been popping, is there an alternative motive for staying out for a while? I don't know. Let me take you back to simpler times. Back in the days where the original UFC events were on VHS tape, far from any occurrences of pay-per-view piracy. The days of the early UFC and Pride Championship where anarchy reigned, there were little to no rules, no weight classes, and an epoch of performance-enhancing drug-fueled mass monsters, a time where the Banes of the world were dropped into a cage to see who was the juiciest man alive. We had the likes of Alistair Overeem, Ken Shamrock, Kimbo Slice, Kevin Randleman, and TRT Belfort, whose traps you could literally ski down. We had Brock Lesnar, whose daughter is a legit clone of him, but with hair. She just broke a shot put record, by the way, of course. The list goes on. This was a chaotic era, watching these absolute mutants brawl it out.
Let them fight.
However, in 2015 this would ultimately come to an end. Enter the US Anti-Doping Agency, or USADA, which is widely known as one of the most astringent and thorough testing agencies. If you are fond of conspiracy, you may believe the implementation of USADA by the UFC was nothing more than strategy in the lead up to the UFC's sale to Endeavour, to create the veneer of a somewhat civilized organisation. Whether true or not, it became just that, and we witnessed the great physique melting, where multiple of the aforementioned juice monsters started devolving like sad Pokemon. Belfort did his reverse transformation and looked like Mr. Krabs when he lost his shell. Same with Ubereem, who became more of a modest Liftereem, eventually becoming Amphetamine. And Johnny Hendricks lost his ability to make weight due to the banning of the use of IV drips to aid the rehydration process, which caused him to go on and miss weight 3 times. And when you compare the physiques of that of the early UFC days to now, you will notice a stark contrast. Now there are often memes surrounding the lackluster physiques of fighters, such as having to explain to your non-MMA mates that the guy on the right would murder the guy on the left with ease. You just can't imagine this sentiment back in the early days where everyone was in their Bane era. USADA was an immediate pain in the bollocks for the roster, and were known to be absolute nuisances, with instances of them knocking on fighters' doors at silly hours of the morning.
They were waking guys up at 6:30 in the morning on their fucking weigh-in day. They were doing crazy shit like that, trying to get samples day of the
Naturally,
fight.
this has caused some problems. Once Cowboy Cerrone even pulled a gun on the USADA geezer who was just there to collect a crumb of urine, bless him. USADA even went as far to send a dude into the middle of the Mediterranean to board Conor's yacht to take his piss as well. Waking fighters up early on weigh-in day to get the meat and 2-veg stared at as they piss into a tube is a bit astonishing, but it's all worth it because in return for all that you get, drumroll please, a pin. Despite the reliability of USADA's rigorous nature, there are still many fighters that manage to circumvent the testing practices and slip through the net undetected, with Cheeto Vera saying all you need is 20,000 and a good chemist to have a tailor-made designer drug made specifically for them, and to be given the strategies to avoid USADA. And with so many physiques in the UFC still looking slightly sus, it's safe to say there are still plenty of fighters riddled with it. The partnership between the UFC and USADA ultimately ended as a result of the UFC wanting an exemption of the rules for Conor to return sooner. So after Conor smashed his leg to pieces in his fight against Dustin Poirier at UFC 264, he was obviously fearing that his career was over. So he did honestly what anyone would do in that scenario and got juiced to the frigging gills, bruv. And it worked splendidly well. He recovered quickly, pics were coming out looking like he'd just scranned Henry Cejudo. We're yet to see how he will fare in the octagon when he does return, as it's notable that Chris Weidman and Anderson Silva were never the same after their respective leg breaks. The UFC was doing everything they could to pressure USADA to let Conor fight before he'd completed his mandatory 6 months in the testing pool, but USADA, having the ultimate decision, said nah mate, he would need at least 6 months in the testing pool as well as 2 negative tests during this time. Things took a slightly turbulent turn and USADA, in a very salty manner, announced their separation with the UFC without even having discussed it first, which is very mean girls of them. Dana labelled this as a dirty move, and the UFC are still proceeding to take legal action.
Fucking illegal.
Many fighters took to Twitter to react to the news of USADA and UFC splitting, with the general consensus that there will be an astronomical rise in the case of PED use within the UFC starting from 2024. Going forward, the UFC will be re-implementing TESTA via a company called DFSI, or Drug Free Sport International, to which USADA head Jeff Nowitzki himself labelled the DFSI's overall process as smarter, more efficient, more effective technology, and more convenient for the athletes. However, it should be noted that the DFSI's involvement with the UFC seems to be purely to do with sample collection, so they will deal with the collection of bloods and urine samples, and whereas USADA would also deal with the administration and sanctioning, that won't be the case here, as the UFC has created their own company, CSAD, who will be responsible for the decision making, and they have hand-picked the head of the company as George Pirro, an ex-FBI agent who led the interrogation of Saddam Hussein. And you could say that there's a conflict of interest with George Pirro being in charge, as he has very close connections to American Top Team, as well as many of the fighters, including our new one retiree, you guessed it, Jorge Masvidal. And to make it even fishier, Pirro himself has changed his Instagram handle from ATT to BJJ, as to not appear as a conflict of interest, which raises alarm bells immediately. Do you really think you wouldn't make certain golden boys like McGregor exempt from staying in the 6-month pool? Because to me it would seem that George Pirro is merely a puppet for the UFC, and they will be pulling the strings in terms of who they will and will not be lenient to regarding the sanctions and arbitrations of fighters. Conor McGregor being Exhibit A, so you may as well consider the UFC to be fully in control here. And the UFC has tried this before with Brock Lesnar when he was about to face Mark Hunt, in which case they actually did win this appeal over USADA. I have no idea how, this guy was always going to piss nuclear, but it wasn't until a year later until he popped, and his win over Mark Hunt was removed and turned to a no contest. And as mentioned before, with a bunch of fighters immediately announcing returns upon the exit of USADA, it speaks to the potential lack of credibility this new program has, as the fighters may believe the 6-month testing period will just be waived, with many people arguing that no testing would lead to a more even playing field. But that's assuming every single fighter would want to take performance-enhancing drugs. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to increase my chances of heart disease and die at 44 like Kevin Randleman, or have my ball bag shrivel up to the size of a raisin. So it is in fact horrendously uneven playing field, and makes it all the more dangerous to the fellas that choose to stay natty. I also feel that everyone being on steroids in some juicy free-for-all would negate the underdog story, which would be a killjoy. The underdog would now just be the guys that can't afford the best designer drugs and chemists. Essentially, the UFC parted ways with USADA because they didn't like how strict they were, to put it succinctly. They didn't bend the rules for Conor McGregor like they did for Brock Lesnar back in the day, and with Dana being the promoter and ultimately wanting full control over the fights he can make, it's no surprise to me that the new way of dealing with testing is more ambiguous in nature and leaves a lot more open to interpretation. And we will certainly see exemptions made if it suits the UFC. They're a promotion at the end of the day, and getting the events through the door are the main priority. So fellas, what do you think? Will we see a random gatekeeper all of a sudden become the GOAT? Will we start to see physiques megamorph? Let me know. Watch this video next, and subscribe if you want. I'm not your dad. Cheers.